Michael Avery had never planned on leaving the city. For over 2 decades, he'd lived among steel and glass, a man perfectly comfortable in the hum of climate-controlled offices, quarterly performance reviews, and the sterile calm of data-driven operations. He wasn't cold, just efficient, private, and endlessly focused. A systems thinker by trade and temperament, he had spent years in regulatory consulting, building frameworks that helped businesses pass environmental audits and meet compliance codes. He didn't call himself a crusader, but he believed in structure, quietly, steadily, like one believes in gravity. That belief cracked the year his firm was swallowed whole by a larger predatory conglomerate, stripping everything he'd helped shape into a marketing checklist. He walked out not with fanfare but with a single box of files and the severance they offered, and he didn't look back. The ranch wasn't a dream. It wasn't romantic. It was a calculation, a place to apply his knowledge, stretch it against real land, real systems, real consequences. 17 acres of sun-scored earth on the edge of a county no one bothered to pave completely. The property had gone untouched for years, its previous owners having failed to maintain the infrastructure or pay taxes on time, eventually folding to an online auction platform. Michael had found the listing at 3 a.m. during a bout of insomnia, and something about the terrain map pulled him in. It had a natural incline, a seasonal creek, and just enough elevation variance to allow for soil testing across microzones. He didn't buy it to get away from people. He bought it to see if he could restore something. He'd spent his life diagnosing system failures from boardrooms. Now he wanted to try his hand at correcting one with his own hands. The land wasn't welcoming at first. The soil was exhausted, compacted by misuse, poisoned by years of neglected lawn chemicals, and scorched by the harsh California sun. There were no buildings worth saving, only the shell of an old cabin he later converted into a soil lab with his own tools and blueprint sketches. The first 6 months were spent not planting, but listening, tracking rainfall patterns, charting wind flow, monitoring native insect activity, and mapping fungal networks under the few surviving trees. He invested in a small but sophisticated array of solar panels, designed a passive irrigation loop, and installed water catchments with built-in filtration. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't need to be. Michael wasn't interested in creating a hobby farm for social media. He was building a closed-loop biome, a functioning ecosystem guided by research and restraint. Every decision was made with purpose, each seed selected for its compatibility with the existing microflora. He planted clover and fescue to stabilize the upper terrace and introduced cover crops to reduce erosion. In a quiet corner near the South Ridge, he started what he simply called the Experimental Grove, a carefully structured garden of edible perennials, pollinator attractants, medicinal herbs, and a row of heritage fruit trees he grafted himself over. Months. For a long while, no one noticed. The property was far enough from the main road that most drivers mistook the access trail for a utility path. The neighbors were spread far and wide, retired couples, hobbyists, and one old family who hadn't touched their acreage since the 70s. The quiet suited him, and Michael thrived in the silence. He'd wake early, make strong coffee, review sensor readouts, and spend hours pruning, rechecking soil moisture, or updating notes in his field ledger. He wasn't avoiding people. He simply had no need to invite them. That changed the moment a glossy trifold pamphlet appeared in his mailbox one morning, tucked under an envelope bearing a stylized logo he didn't recognize. The letter inside was polite but firm. You are in violation of aesthetic compliance standards as outlined in Article 6, Section 4. Please contact the community board to resolve this issue or risk further penalty. Michael reread the paragraph twice, confused. There was no community board. At least not one he was a member of. He checked the property deed, title survey, zoning definitions, everything. His land wasn't included in any of the residential districts. He had specifically verified that during the purchase. Still, the pamphlet listed his address under a recently annexed perimeter zone, claiming it now fell within the boundaries of a private neighborhood association that had expanded their jurisdiction. No vote, no notification, just a line on a map that had moved without his consent. He ignored it at first. He thought perhaps it was a clerical error, a wrong address, or the work of a particularly aggressive real estate volunteer. But within a week, a second letter arrived. This one less polite, attaching a photograph of his South Terrace garden and an itemized fine for non-compliant landscaping, unauthorized plant groupings, non-standard fencing, exposed compost structures. The fine was modest, $250, but the implication was not. Michael understood systems. He knew how policies metastasized, how minor allowances became footholds for deeper encroachments. This wasn't about the garden. It was about leverage. And someone, somewhere in that neighboring cluster of identical beige houses, had decided that his self-managed, meticulously kept ranch violated their illusion of order. It didn't take long to learn who. Her name was Karen Lutz. She lived in the nearest developed parcel, a quarter-mile downhill, in a recently built craftsman-style home with an artificial lawn and weekly landscapers. She was, by her own admission at a town hall meeting, deeply invested in the neighborhood's future. Michael hadn't met her until she arrived unannounced at his gate one late morning, holding a clipboard and flashing a brittle smile. She introduced herself with the cheer of someone selling raffle tickets and began talking before he could answer. She mentioned property cohesion, visual harmony, and collective value. She gestured toward his grove and asked, with barely disguised distaste, if the agricultural project had a completion date in mind. Michael responded calmly, informing her that the land was private, that he was not under any jurisdictional obligation to conform to neighborhood landscaping standards, and that his garden had legal and ecological justification. Karen's smile faltered. She made a note on her clipboard and walked away, but not before muttering something about setting dangerous precedents. The next week, Michael received a notice citing him for water overuse, despite the fact that he was off-grid and used reclaimed rainwater. Then came a complaint about pest attraction, implying that his plants were harboring rodents. A wildlife officer confirmed his compost was sealed and compliant. None of it mattered. The paperwork kept coming. Every letter was more bureaucratic, more obtuse, and every fine slightly higher. Michael recognized the tactic. Death by 1,000 regulations. Isolate, pressure, erode. And if he didn't respond the way they wanted, if he resisted, then he'd become the problem. Not the system, not the map, not the creeping overreach of petty suburban power, but him. He would be labeled as hostile, uncooperative, disruptive. He could feel the narrative being built like scaffolding around him, slowly, methodically, and he understood that what was at stake wasn't just the garden or the soil or the fruit trees he'd nursed into bloom. It was control over his land, his time, and the right to determine the shape of the life he had chosen. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call the press. He did what he had always done. He studied the rules, learned the terrain, and quietly began to look for the system's weakest point. Because Michael Avery didn't fight chaos with chaos. He outdesigned it. And this time, the blueprint would be personal. It was early April when the tone shifted from annoying to overtly hostile. What had begun as sporadic letters escalated into structured action. Michael returned one morning from a supply run, picking up reclaimed wood and irrigation fittings from a warehouse 2 counties over, to find a small, laminated notice zip-tied to his gate. It wasn't handwritten or casual. It bore a formal seal and precise legal phrasing. Notice of non-compliance. Unapproved land alteration within residential boundary extension zone. The sign was nailed beneath it. Metal. Permanent. The kind of signage that indicated this wasn't just a warning. It was a claim. Michael stared at it for a full minute, key still in hand, before cutting the ties and pocketing the document. He didn't speak aloud, didn't curse, didn't even frown. But something internal reoriented, a slow recalibration he hadn't felt in years. Inside, he read the full document. It cited violations of Section 18 of the Residential Order Act, referencing the amended perimeter annex passed quietly the previous year by a committee he'd never heard of. His property, according to this revision, had been rolled into a buffer district for the sake of environmental and aesthetic continuity, even though the surrounding parcels remained privately zoned and unregulated. The fine had now climbed to over $1,000, and the letter included a due date and a threat of lien placement if unresolved. This wasn't noise anymore. It was an active effort to make him surrender control, not by seizing the land outright, but by burdening it with enough friction to force capitulation. Michael didn't take long to act. He printed the documents, highlighted the inconsistencies, and scheduled a consultation with a land use attorney 3 towns over. The attorney, a pragmatic man with a coffee-stained tie and a dry sense of humor, skimmed the pages in silence before leaning back and saying, "They're pushing jurisdictional gray zones. It's not technically illegal, but it's absolutely challengeable." When Michael asked how common this tactic was, the man just nodded slowly. "In unincorporated areas? More than you'd think. They bank on you folding early. Most people do." That was the hinge moment, when Michael knew he wasn't just the target of one persistent neighbor's campaign. He was now a test subject for administrative overreach engineered to appear procedural and benign. Karen reappeared that weekend, this time accompanied by another woman, taller, severe, with an angular face and a leather-bound portfolio. They arrived mid-morning, stepping out of a spotless white SUV parked neatly just off the easement. Michael didn't greet them. He was pruning along the orchard fence line, clippers in hand, gloves still damp from earlier dew. They approached without invitation, Karen waving like this was a social call. "Michael," she said with that clipped brightness that always preceded confrontation, "I'd like you to meet Fiona Myers. She's with the Community Oversight Council. She's helping us integrate properties like yours into the development map." Michael set down his clippers, removed one glove, and nodded once without extending his hand. Fiona stepped forward, flipping open the portfolio to reveal aerial maps, overlays, and a stack of letters already bearing his address. "Mr. Avery," she began, "we're in the process of finalizing the rezoning framework for this quadrant. Your lot currently sits on the edge of 2 community-defined visual corridors. That makes it a shared impact property." He didn't interrupt. He simply waited. She continued, undeterred. "As such, your improvements need to adhere to community standards. This includes fencing, plant selection, and any visible structures. We're not asking you to remove everything, just to align with established code so we can avoid further escalation." Michael looked at the documents. None bore county stamps. They were internal memos, self-authored policy drafts pretending to be law. "So," he said evenly, "you created a new boundary, decided I was part of it, and are now penalizing me for not complying with rules I never agreed to?" Fiona didn't flinch. "We understand transitions can be difficult. That's why we're offering you a compliance grace period. 30 days. Karen nodded solemnly, as if this were an act of mercy. Michael simply stepped back, picked up his clippers, and said, "You're trespassing. This is private land. Next time, I recommend calling ahead." They didn't argue. They turned and left, but Fiona paused at the gate, lowering her voice. "You don't want to escalate this, Mr. Avery. We have procedural options." Michael replied without looking at her. "So do I." Over the next week, enforcement accelerated. A local code inspector, whose badge had been affixed with Velcro and whose credentials listed no contact number, showed up with a clipboard and a camera, walking the perimeter and taking pictures without speaking. When Michael approached, the man simply muttered, "Routine documentation," and refused to answer further questions. A flagged notice appeared in his property tax portal, citing disputed use designation. Mail deliveries began arriving late or misrouted. At one point, the parcel drop box was relocated 50 feet down the road without explanation. But Michael didn't yell, didn't threaten. He documented. He logged every visit, every notice, every piece of correspondence. He copied records, recorded timestamps, and filed a formal inquiry through the county assessor's office to verify whether the zoning update had any legal basis. 3 days later, he received a polite phone call from a county clerk apologizing for the confusion and confirming that his land was still designated rural private use with no current overlays. "Oh," the clerk's voice grew careful when Michael asked who had submitted the zoning change requests. "We've seen a lot of these recently," she said. "Some of them originate from neighborhood boards acting outside proper process. I'd recommend speaking to your representative or filing a challenge with the Property Rights Commission." The commission. That's where it turned. Michael filed the paperwork. No drama, no headlines. Just an envelope with the correct forms, notarized and sent certified mail. He included copies of all correspondence, proof of tax payments, and a map clearly showing that no vote or notification had ever reached him. In the same envelope, he submitted a motion to audit the boundary vote that had allegedly passed, citing procedural irregularities. It was a long shot, but it was enough to force a pause in enforcement. For the first time in weeks, the fines stopped. The letters slowed. No more unannounced visits. Karen stopped walking her dog near the orchard. But the silence wasn't victory. It was recalibration. He knew that. Bureaucracies don't retreat. They adapt. The real catalyst wasn't the paperwork or the notices or the thinly veiled threats. It came late one night when Michael was walking the lower path of the orchard, checking on the drainage after a spring storm. The moon was low, the air thick with ozone. He reached the fence line and saw it. 2 of his newly planted cherry trees, snapped at the base. Not cut, broken, as if someone had leaned into them with a boot and shattered the trunks. The soil around the roots was disturbed. Footprints, faint but visible. Someone had been there. Not a raccoon or deer, someone. He stood in the dark for a long time, not moving, not speaking, until the wind shifted and the scent of disturbed mulch drifted up. It wasn't just sabotage, it was a message. Unmistakable. You're being watched. You're being challenged. The next morning, he installed discreet perimeter sensors. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't tell anyone. He simply widened his scope and began planning not just a response, but a correction. They wanted control through nuisance. He'd answer through ownership. Not the kind you put on paper, but the kind that rearranges the entire structure. Michael Avery wasn't going to fight them on their turf. He was going to build something they couldn't touch, because he'd own the foundation they were standing on. And that meant taking the fight somewhere they wouldn't see it coming. Michael didn't retaliate immediately. That was never his style. He studied before he acted. For 2 weeks following the incident with the cherry trees, he continued his routines as if nothing had happened. Early mornings tending the garden, late afternoons analyzing moisture levels and soil balance, long evenings under low lights reading, through zoning codes and cross-referencing county land use statutes. To an outsider, he looked undisturbed, perhaps even defeated. But every action he took was deliberate, every silence strategic. Beneath that calm, he was assembling a map. not just of land and law, but of weakness. And one afternoon, while reviewing outdated development plans at the county archives, he found it. A narrow parcel listed as Public Utility Overflow, Lot 14C, originally designated for community storage and auxiliary parking during the expansion years ago. The lot was never developed. It sat overgrown and neglected, roughly 200 feet behind the administrative building that housed the neighborhood board's occasional meetings. Its status had remained unchanged for almost a decade, and according to public access records, it had been flagged for review under the county's inactive asset program. That meant if no use could be proven, the land could be released for sale, often at a reduced rate under specific conditions, particularly to entities proposing agricultural or conservation use. Michael didn't smile, didn't cheer, didn't even speak aloud. He simply made a note, printed the relevant files, and left the building with a slow, measured pace. The next morning, he contacted a private intermediary he had worked with before, someone reliable, discreet, and experienced in non-standard real estate acquisitions. Through this channel, he submitted a bid to acquire Lot 14C under the name of a small agricultural trust he had quietly registered months earlier as part of a broader experimental cultivation initiative. He included a use plan, documentation of eco-compatible methods, and a projected 5-year maintenance strategy. Nothing flashy, nothing suspicious. Just enough vision and responsibility to make the proposal attractive to an overburdened land commission eager to clear dormant entries. Within 3 weeks, the offer was approved, and the deed was transferred. Just like that, Michael legally owned a portion of land previously considered community adjacent. More importantly, he now had control over a plot directly connected, legally and symbolically, to the infrastructure of the very group attempting to control him. He didn't move quickly. That would have been too loud. Instead, he began restoration slowly, clearing debris and building raised beds near the perimeter. He installed fencing, not ornamental, but clean and professional. Then came the mulch, the gravel paths, and the saplings, plums, pears, and figs. He structured the design like a grid, symmetrical and inviting, yet clearly private. No signs, no barriers, just trees and space. He added a bench, unfinished cedar, rustic, deliberately modest. People noticed within days. Residents walking by slowed to stare. Cars paused near the back road. Someone began a thread on a neighborhood forum speculating whether the board had approved a community orchard. Karen, of course, had other theories. She approached one afternoon, hovering near the edge like a hawk circling a new fence post. "Lovely setup," she called, trying to sound casual. "Is this part of your private project?" Michael nodded once without pausing his work. "Yes." She stepped closer. "You do realize this is common adjacent land? The board may have questions." Michael straightened, looked directly at her, and replied with clinical calm, "I own it, fully and privately. Purchased from the county under appropriate statute." The deed is recorded. Questions should be directed to the public registry. Karen didn't respond. She just stood there, lips pursed, eyes darting across the orchard's neatly aligned rows, the color rising in her face. Within a week, the emails resumed, this time from the board itself. Not about Michael's original land, but about the new orchard. They claimed it interfered with community access points and posed a potential visibility hazard for board meetings due to new foot traffic patterns. Michael, already prepared, responded with documentation. Surveyor maps, access easement proof, and photographic evidence showing that the plot had been unused and unmaintained for over a decade. He sent it all with a 2-line statement. "As owner of Parcel 14C, I am operating within all legal and environmental regulations. Further inquiries should be directed to county officials." There was no legal foundation left for them to stand on, and for a moment it seemed the pressure would subside. But Michael knew better. Cornered power does not retreat, it doubles down. Sure enough, the next escalation came not through letters but through whispers. Rumors began to circulate among nearby residents. False claims that Michael was applying chemical treatments harmful to pets, that he was using illegal irrigation taps, that his trees were non-native and invasive. Some neighbors, previously indifferent, now crossed the street when walking past his gate. A few children who once waved now looked away. It wasn't personal hostility. It was engineered discomfort. Michael could trace the pattern clearly. Isolate, discredit, provoke. He had seen it in boardrooms and political committees. This was just a smaller, pettier version of the same playbook. One morning, he found a small sign staked just outside the entrance to his orchard. Warning: unregulated agricultural activity ahead. Proceed at own risk. It bore no signature, no official seal, just implication. Michael removed it calmly, took a photograph, and stored it in his log. What they didn't expect was how quietly the community itself would begin to shift. One elderly couple asked if they could walk through the orchard. He allowed it, setting a few boundaries. The next week, a local school teacher requested permission to bring a small class for a field sketching session. Michael agreed, requiring the parents' waivers and supervision. He wasn't building alliances, not directly. He was simply letting truth exist beside fiction. As people entered the space, breathed its quiet order, and saw its purpose, the narrative began to crack. Not fully, but visibly. And that's when the board made their move. A formal complaint was filed against Michael, this time with the county's Environmental Review Division. It claimed water misuse, unsanctioned terrain alteration, and improper handling of organic waste. The language was precise, the accusations veiled in technical terms. If not for Michael's meticulous record-keeping and documentation, it might have succeeded. But he submitted counterproof: water logs, independent testing results, certified organic management certifications. The division reviewed, visited, and dismissed the complaint within days, sending an official statement. No violations found. No further action recommended. The board never acknowledged the result. But they weren't done. The next tactic was procedural. They attempted to push through a resolution at the next community meeting to formally restrict agricultural activity within a 1-mile buffer of the administrative parcel. Michael, through a contact who still lived within the association's perimeter, obtained a copy of the draft. It was vague, likely unenforceable, and rooted in fabricated language about shared visual identity. But, if passed, it could create the future grounds for nuisance claims. He didn't attend the meeting. Instead, he filed a preemptive cease and desist order through his attorney, outlining clear legal consequences for any attempt to retroactively infringe upon lawfully acquired property or to weaponize policy against documented stewardship. The meeting collapsed into confusion. Residents, many of whom had begun visiting the orchard themselves, pushed back. Questions were raised. Why the sudden urgency? Why now, after so many years of ignoring that land? Why target someone who had done nothing but restore an empty lot? The board faltered. Karen, in particular, found herself answering for inconsistencies. Her claims about Michael's water use contradicted by official inspections. Her earlier denials about involvement in the cherry tree incident challenged by quiet testimony from a local teen who had seen her car parked near the orchard after dark. No resolution passed. The proposed buffer zone died on the floor. And though no one apologized, the message was clear. The board was losing its grip. Michael didn't celebrate. He didn't hold a press conference or give a speech. He simply continued planting, added 3 more rows of citrus, began construction on a tool shed, and made a single, quiet purchase. The remaining adjoining lot, previously used for overflow event parking, now flagged as inactive and available for review. He was building not just resilience, but permanence, and that was something the board could neither fine nor ignore. Not anymore. By midsummer, the orchard had matured beyond its initial purpose. What had begun as a strategic buffer, an active defense dressed in agriculture, had become a living, self-sustaining testament to design and defiance. The trees were in bloom, their canopies casting precise measured shadows over mulch-lined beds. Bees worked quietly among the lavender rows, the hum of their movement a soft counterpoint to the dry wind sweeping in from the western ridge. Michael had no illusions about peace. He knew too well that the silence was not stability but recalibration. His opponents had not vanished. They were rethinking, watching, planning. That knowledge didn't deter him. It sharpened his focus. While they conspired through unofficial votes and pseudo-legal frameworks, he had begun a deeper move. One not just of land, but of narrative. He started by initiating a formal registration of his agricultural trust as an educational initiative, drafting a mission statement that emphasized soil restoration, sustainable yield analysis, and public exposure to decentralized permaculture models. It wasn't theater, it was truth, packaged in a language bureaucracies couldn't ignore. He submitted his application not to the local board but to the state-level Department of Resource Management, bypassing the very bodies trying to contain him. By structuring his orchard as a research site with limited public engagement rights, he established legal protections that made interference not just unethical but actionable. The trust's framework included oversight, fiscal transparency, and limited access agreements, all within regulation. It wasn't a shield, it was an armor. Still, Michael didn't let his guard down. One morning, in late July, he received a thick envelope bearing no return address. Inside was a series of glossy photographs, images of his property taken from long range, clearly with professional equipment. The angles were high, likely drone-based, and some had timestamp overlays. Alongside the photos was a printed letter, unsigned, containing vague but deliberate phrases, visible trespass of community aesthetic expectations. Future conflicts can be avoided if proactive decisions are made, and consider relocation as a viable outcome. It wasn't subtle. It was a warning, and not an official one. This wasn't from Karen. This came from deeper within the apparatus, someone who understood how to intimidate without exposing liability. Michael placed the photos in a fireproof folder and forwarded a digital copy to his legal contact, adding only a brief note. This confirms escalation outside policy. What disturbed him more wasn't the surveillance, but what followed. That same week, county inspectors appeared unannounced, not environmental officers but construction enforcement, citing a claim that Michael had expanded a structure on undeclared foundation. The structure in question was a prefabricated storage unit on skids, legally exempt from permitting under the county's own accessory regulations. When Michael requested the name behind the complaint, the inspector refused, citing anonymity rights. But the timing was too precise to dismiss. Someone was now trying to leverage enforcement agencies not just to harass him, but to build a record of infractions, fabricated or otherwise, that could be used against him in a broader legal strike. Michael didn't push back emotionally. He filed a formal review request, submitted video evidence of the unit's installation, and attached precedent rulings from similar cases. He knew that the county, though bloated and flawed, couldn't afford to support a fraudulent campaign indefinitely, especially if those campaigns began overlapping with public resource misuse. What he did next was quieter but more powerful. He met with a local agricultural liaison, an aging field officer who had seen enough land fights to recognize the smell of misuse. Over coffee, Michael explained the situation, not with drama, but with facts. He showed the letters, the fake fines, the failed buffer vote. He showed the orchard's design plans, the educational mission, the tax compliance reports. The officer listened, said little, and left with a copy of the trust documents. 3 weeks later, Michael received word that his site had been listed for provisional partnership in a statewide grant program for urban edge regenerative land models. It wasn't funding. Not yet. But it was recognition, backed by state resources and archived in databases far beyond the reach of any neighborhood board. That moment was the fulcrum. Everything that followed stemmed from that quiet, irreversible shift. Michael was no longer simply a private landowner defending himself from bureaucratic trespass. He was now a legally recognized project lead with backing from agencies his opponents couldn't manipulate. Every attempt to corner him would now be filtered through channels requiring more than suggestion and pressure. It would require proof, and that was something they lacked. Still, Michael remained vigilant. He expanded the orchard carefully, not in size but in depth, introducing terraced beds with nitrogen fixers, stabilizing slopes with native shrubbery, and launching a data collection program to track biodiversity recovery. He installed motion-triggered wildlife cameras, not just for ecological study, but to have a digital trail. He cataloged species returns, soil composition changes, even pollen drift patterns. These were not hobbies. They were records, dense, factual, and court-admissible. Karen's presence became less direct but no less persistent. She stopped approaching him, stopped issuing complaints personally, but her signature began appearing again, this time on a petition circulated among the remaining core of board loyalists. The petition wasn't aimed at Michael directly, but at restoring neighborhood visual identity and reestablishing proper use boundaries. It didn't name him, but its language mirrored the buffer zone proposal almost word for word. Michael knew better than to ignore it. He quietly hired a compliance analyst to trace any policy motions initiated in response to the petition. As expected, attempts were made to reintroduce zoning language through procedural amendments, none of which could pass without external review now that his land was partially state-affiliated. The board began fracturing. 2 members resigned quietly. A third, after being confronted by residents about the misuse of inspection resources, stepped down with a terse email citing personal reasons. Michael said nothing publicly. He didn't need to. His strategy had never relied on popularity or applause. It relied on the system's own weight, used correctly, patiently, and without arrogance. By late summer, the orchard had become something else entirely. Not a battlefield, not a symbol, but a functional, thriving biome, a living rebuke to every regulation misused against it. Children came to sketch in the mornings. Retirees wandered through in the afternoons. No signs invited them, but none pushed them away either. Michael continued his work. Quiet, intentional, focused, and as the first figs ripened on the northern row, he made a note in his journal. Phase transition confirmed, pressure absorbed, momentum now structural. He had reached the center of the conflict, not with a shout, but with growth. And now it was their system that had to find a way to survive his presence. By early autumn, Michael had stopped expecting fairness. He wasn't cynical, just realistic. When systems feel threatened, they don't retreat or compromise. They entrench, they twist, and if necessary, they destroy their own foundations to preserve a version of order that no longer exists. The orchard, now fully rooted and thriving, had ceased to be merely a physical reclamation of space. It had become a mirror, and in that mirror, the neighborhood board, Karen, and those still clinging to their quietly decaying authority saw something they couldn't ignore. Proof that their grip on this land, on this illusion of unity, was neither absolute nor unchallenged. That, more than any violation or infraction, was intolerable. The next move came not from Karen, but from a figure Michael hadn't yet encountered. His name was Douglas Greer, recently appointed District Community Alignment Coordinator, a role that seemed to exist entirely to manage external conflicts that could reflect poorly on the board. Douglas arrived one morning in an official vehicle bearing a state seal, though Michael immediately noted that it was from the Department of Intercommunity Affairs, a liaison agency with advisory power but no enforcement authority. Still, Douglas carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He requested a friendly review meeting to address escalating concerns, and though Michael had no obligation to comply, he agreed. The meeting took place under the canopy of the Central Orchard Row, shaded and quiet. Douglas, trim in a tailored shirt and bright tie, opened a leather folio and began with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There's growing concern," he began, "that your ongoing development efforts, though well-intentioned, may be straining the social fabric of the neighborhood ecosystem." Michael didn't blink. "I wasn't aware I was part of any neighborhood ecosystem," he replied evenly. Douglas leaned forward, hands folded neatly. "Community identity is not bound strictly by property lines. Shared environment, shared resources, shared perception, these contribute to cohesion." Michael allowed a pause, then replied, "Perception is not policy, and cohesion isn't consent." The smile flickered. Douglas shifted gears. "We'd like to offer a transition plan. Assistance with relocating some of your more visible installations, perhaps buffering the orchard with privacy hedges, reducing structural footprint, maybe decommissioning the tool shed if it doesn't meet updated visibility thresholds." Michael cut him off. "Let me be clear. The orchard is legally established, privately owned, and recognized by multiple state programs as compliant. You have no jurisdiction. I've documented all attempts to alter that fact. If this is a threat, make it plainly." Douglas closed the folio slowly. "It's not a threat, but continued defiance may force the board's hand." Michael stood. "Then I suggest they use both hands. They'll need them." What followed was the fastest attempt at procedural containment Michael had seen so far. Within 10 days, multiple agencies received simultaneous reports of non-compliance, fire risk due to vegetation density, unsanitary waste storage, suspicious unauthorized gatherings, and even allegations of undocumented migrant labor. Each report triggered a separate visit. Fire inspection, sanitation review, zoning verification, and a visit from a labor enforcement officer who spent 15 uncomfortable minutes reviewing his tool logs before offering an awkward apology and leaving. The pattern was obvious. The accusations were paper-thin, but the frequency was the weapon. Create enough turbulence and eventually the structure shakes. Michael responded methodically. He prepared complete packets for each inquiry, time-stamped photographs, operation logs, letters of exemption, and verified labor statements. Each agency, upon review, withdrew their claims. But each withdrawal took time, attention, and energy. That was the point. It was procedural fatigue by design. Even a strong defense weakens when it has to fight on 10 fronts. That was when Michael realized the game had shifted again. They were no longer trying to prove him wrong. They were trying to wear him down. He countered in kind, not with aggression but with escalation of transparency. He contacted the office of a regional agricultural supervisor and invited them to perform a formal site review for consideration in a conservation zoning exemption program. If granted, it would shield the land from any future reclassification attempts and tie its designation directly to state-level preservation protocols. The review team arrived 2 weeks later, clipboard in hand, notes ready. Michael gave them a full walkthrough, detailing water management, soil restoration metrics, native species reintroduction, and pest management strategy. They asked questions. He answered without salesmanship, only facts. One inspector near the end muttered, "This is cleaner than half the grant-funded pilot sites we've seen." That comment was never official, but it confirmed what Michael suspected. While his opponents played games, he was building systems. And systems last longer than pressure. Still, the pressure didn't stop. Late October brought a coordinated smear campaign across online platforms. A series of anonymous posts appeared on local forums and community watch sites accusing Michael of hoarding land for personal profit, lying about nonprofit status, and creating an unsafe zone for children. Someone even claimed they had witnessed unknown individuals entering the orchard at night with containers, implying drug activity. These weren't accusations. They were reputational toxins, meant not to trigger legal response, but social suspicion. And it worked. Briefly. The trickle of visitors to the orchard dried up. The sketch class canceled their return. A father who had once asked about tree grafting now avoided eye contact when passing by. Michael didn't attempt to chase rumors. He knew better than to play defense on a battlefield designed to blur truth. Instead, he documented every post, tracked metadata where possible, and passed it to a cybersecurity contact who owed him a favor. Within days, a trail emerged, not definitive, but strongly suggestive. Several of the posts originated from devices pinged near the administrative center during known board meeting times. Others came from a nearby residence registered under the name of a former board member's nephew. Michael didn't publish the findings. He filed them, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment leverage mattered. In the meantime, he focused on reinforcing the orchard's status. He filed for a historic designation based on the land's documented use in early agricultural trials. He commissioned an independent ecological impact report, showing year-over-year soil vitality increase, bird and pollinator return, and climate resiliency metrics. These weren't just reports. They were shields, built not of passion or defiance, but data. Cold, irrefutable, layered fact. Then came the break-in, or rather, the staged intrusion. One morning, Michael arrived to find one of his water tanks unlatched and partially drained. Not vandalized, no signs of force, no damage to the valve, just open, as if someone had wanted it to look careless. Near the fence, tire tracks. Not recent, but not old either, and a trail of footprints booted, deliberate, leading nowhere. Michael checked the camera feed. Nothing. System had been jammed. Local interference not sophisticated but enough to scramble signal for an hour. He knew what this was. A provocation. They wanted him to react. To rage, to accuse, to misstep. He didn't. He called no one. Filed no report. Just logged the incident in his journal and moved on. Because escalation only works if the target engages. And Michael was done playing by their tempo. Instead, he made a call. One he'd been saving. A contact in the Regional Resource Allocation Office. Someone with discretionary power over emergency land use grants. The orchard now qualified as a secondary research site due to its ecological data collection metrics. If approved, it would receive state monitoring equipment, be placed under audit-protected review, and any future interference would require cross-agency clearance. Michael submitted the application. 48 hours later, it was accepted. Not because he pleaded, but because he met every line of requirement with brutal precision. When the news reached the board, panic spread. Because now, to touch the orchard meant inviting inspection, and inspection is the natural enemy of secrets. Karen reappeared shortly after. She didn't bring threats. She brought an offer. A polite letter, hand-delivered, proposing a community integration plan. She suggested converting part of the orchard into a shared space, naming it after a founding resident, establishing a symbolic peace garden to heal past divisions, Michael read the letter 3 times, then burned it. Not out of anger, but clarity. There was no settlement left to be made. What they had tried to erase had become permanent. Not because he fought harder, but because he built better. The second escalation had failed. Not because it lacked intensity, but because it lacked foundation. And now, the weight of every false claim, every misuse of process, every whisper of sabotage, all of it had started to collapse back inward, not as a sudden implosion, but as a slow gravitational pull. Michael could feel it, and he was no longer just surviving it. He was outlasting it, which meant the final confrontation was no longer a question of if, only when. By November, the conflict had lost its subtlety. Whatever illusion remained that this was a civil disagreement among neighbors or a bureaucratic misunderstanding had evaporated completely. The remaining board members had stopped pretending that their actions were about safety, unity, or neighborhood character. The veil had dropped. Their efforts now reeked of desperation, and Michael saw it in every step they took. An increasingly erratic sequence of maneuvers meant not to win, but to damage, to sabotage, to punish for the sheer act of resistance. And yet, for all the noise, all the sabotage, all the exhausted procedural traps, Michael had not only held the orchard intact, he had fortified it, embedded it in enough protective frameworks, audits, registrations, and oversight processes that even state officials now hesitated to question its legitimacy. That reality did not dissuade the board. It pushed them over the edge. The escalation came as Michael had suspected it would, not through further regulatory channels, but through a sudden, unauthorized, emergency action. He returned one afternoon from a consultation at a neighboring farm to find county contracted workers digging near the base of his property line. An excavator sat idling beside a stack of temporary fencing, and several men in safety vests were unloading rolls of orange netting. At first, it looked like routine work, maybe a utility maintenance crew. But then he saw the markers, plastic flags running directly into the lower orchard, cutting through the western row of the peach trees and terminating just beyond his rain catchment basin. When he approached, the foreman offered only a vague answer. "We've got orders for runoff containment improvements, storm drain expansion." Michael asked for a work order. There was none, just a verbal directive from the district alignment office. That was all Michael needed to hear. This wasn't stormwater control. This was an engineered intrusion. Without a single raised voice, Michael documented everything. Photos, timestamps, positions of vehicles, placement of stakes. He contacted his attorney, then the county's environmental division, then the Department of Agriculture, all within the hour. By dusk, the crew had been pulled from the site under a temporary suspension order, pending review of jurisdictional authority. But the damage had already been done. Several tree roots had been severed. The soil perimeter had been compacted. And, more importantly, someone had tried to establish physical presence on land protected under multiple binding agreements. That was no longer nuisance. That was unlawful entry with material harm. It was, legally and practically, a line crossed. Michael knew what had happened. He could see the outlines even if he didn't know the specific hands. Someone on the board had pulled a favor, leaned on a mid-level liaison, and pushed for an undocumented intervention, hoping that by the time Michael responded, the work would be too far along to reverse. They hadn't anticipated how fast he could move. They hadn't anticipated that he'd already filed contingency protections. The next morning, Michael submitted an injunction request, backed by the Department of Agriculture's compliance affidavit. Within 48 hours, the project was frozen indefinitely, pending investigation. The orchard, again, had survived. But this time, the attack wasn't procedural or reputational. It had been physical, and it had consequences. The investigation exposed far more than intended. In tracing the source of the emergency directive, County auditors uncovered irregular correspondence between Douglas Greer and a private contractor with close ties to one of the board members. Though nothing immediately criminal, the communications revealed an unapproved discussion of parcel activity, misuse of internal planning maps, and a failed attempt to list Michael's orchard as infrastructural easement adjacent without notification. Once uncovered, the issue couldn't be ignored. It triggered a departmental review, and with it, the involvement of a county ethics officer. Karen's reaction was immediate. She submitted a letter of resignation from the board, effective pending procedural clarification, citing emotional fatigue and a desire to focus on community healing. No apology, no admission, just a retreat dressed as nobility. Michael read the announcement in a digital bulletin forwarded to him by a former neighbor. He said nothing. The orchard, now bare-limbed for winter, remained his only focus. And that focus was deeper than ever. He began repairs immediately, stabilizing the disturbed row, reintroducing root bacteria, laying protective mulch, and testing groundwater integrity. It was slow work, but measured. He planted no new trees, only reinforced what had endured. This wasn't expansion, it was entrenchment. He knew the board, even fractured, might try once more. Power structures rarely vanish. They morph, hide in subcommittees, whisper through new elections. But now they did so with eyes on them, from state agencies, from watchdog groups, from an increasingly aware community. And then came the letter, delivered not by mail, but by courier. Hand-addressed, signed with dry ink, bearing a letterhead from a regional mediation firm. The sender wasn't Karen, wasn't Douglas. It was the firm representing a new provisional board forming to replace the former council. The letter was brief, cautious, and utterly devoid of warmth. It requested a formal meeting to resolve outstanding tensions and consider mutually beneficial arrangements regarding the orchard's role in neighborhood visual and spatial planning. It was, in tone, the softest surrender possible. A quiet hand extended not in reconciliation, but in necessity. Michael declined the meeting. He responded with a single-page statement, addressed not to the firm, but submitted as a public record. This orchard is not a bargaining chip. It is not a shared canvas. It is not a metaphor for cooperation. It is a legally recognized, privately owned, ecologically functional land initiative established within the full bounds of state and county law. I am not interested in mediation. I am interested in boundaries. Keep yours. The letter went viral within the small ecosystem of local governance forums. Some mocked it, others dissected it. But many, particularly those who had watched the story unfold in fragments, recognized it as what it truly was. A final line drawn by someone who had played every part of the game, answered every challenge with order, and endured every underhanded tactic without once sacrificing clarity or principle. Michael didn't celebrate. He didn't host tours or install plaques. He worked, quietly. The orchard, though dormant for winter, had its own tasks: mulch to turn, systems to drain, branches to prune. But now, each step carried a new weight, not of resistance, but of resolve. Because what had begun as defense had become permanence. And permanence, once earned, is not something easily undone. The battle was not over because someone had yielded. It was over because Michael had made the ground itself unassailable, not by force, not by rage, but by precision, patience, and unshakable intent. By the time winter thawed into early spring, the orchard had taken on a silence that wasn't just seasonal. It was the stillness that follows conflict, a deep, settling quiet, not empty but full of weight, of aftermath, of unspoken acknowledgement. Michael had not won in any conventional sense. There had been no courtroom finale, no decisive press release, no community gathering to crown him with resolution. Instead, there was just the land, breathing steadily beneath the surface, recovering, like a body after surgery. The rows he had planted bore the marks of struggle, disturbed roots, shifted soil, but they held firm. And so did he. The new board, if it could be called that, had retreated into technical maintenance. No further correspondence arrived. No more inspectors, no more veiled threats disguised as memos. Karen's absence lingered in the way a long-term irritant leaves a ghost sensation after it's removed. Her house sat quiet. A "for sale" sign appeared briefly in the yard before being taken down without explanation. Michael didn't inquire. Some departures are better left undocumented. Douglas Greer's name disappeared from the directory. One contact told Michael in passing that he had transitioned to private consulting. Again, Michael said nothing. He had no appetite for vengeance. The system had collapsed under its own weight. That was enough. And the orchard, once treated as a provocation, began to be accepted as part of the landscape. Not embraced. No one threw parties beneath the plum trees or organized potlucks beside the terraced beds, but accepted. Like a landmark. Something that simply was, unchangeable and inevitable. The same neighbors who once whispered online now nodded in passing. Some asked quiet questions about grafting or pest resistance. A few even helped move compost during a late frost. Michael didn't seek connection, but he didn't refuse it either. There was no bitterness in his silence, only clarity. He had not built the orchard for them. But if it served them, even tangentially, that was fine, as long as no one tried to claim it again. The final piece came not with confrontation, but with confirmation. One late afternoon, as the sun cast long amber shadows through the fig row, Michael received a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the California Conservation Registry. Inside was a formal acknowledgement. The orchard, under its trust designation, had been accepted into the Permanent Regenerative Land Archive. It was a formality, yes, but one with teeth. The designation came with oversight protections, tax sheltering, and most importantly, a permanent restriction on any form of forced repurposing or annexation without supermajority vote at the state level. What he had built was now anchored, permanently, legally, and structurally. Not just a garden, not just resistance. Something real. Something that would outlast him. He didn't frame the certificate. He placed it in his filing cabinet, second drawer, next to the original purchase documents and the soil viability reports from the first year. He didn't need it to be visible. He only needed it to be true. That night, he walked the perimeter of the orchard alone. The wind was cold, but not biting. The sky was clear. He moved slowly, checking irrigation valves, tightening a gate hinge, brushing wind-blown leaves from a path. At one point he paused, standing still between two rows of trees, his breath visible in the fading light. He said nothing, but in the quiet, the land seemed to answer, its own language of roots and cycles and endurance. There was no ceremony. No one came to mark the end. But Michael didn't need a marker. The land was enough. The orchard, living and still, bore the only testament he required. Not to conflict, not to struggle, but to design, to discipline, to permanence earned not by force, but by form. And as the night settled in and the wind carried the scent of soil and cold bark, Michael turned, walked back to the cabin, and closed the door behind him without locking it. He no longer needed to.